Before we continue to the fifth WRC closing ceremony, please welcome the cultural performance Barong Dance presented by Pasikian Yowana Bali.
Tari Barongket. Barongket adalah salah satu kesenian barong yang terkenal di Bali. Barong merupakan salah satu tari bebali yang diduga peninggalan kebudayaan pra-Hindu. Kata barong diduga berasal dari bahasa Sanskerta, yaitu barwang atau beruang. Di dalam kehidupan masyarakat Bali, binatang beruang tidak pernah dijumpai, sehingga sosok tersebut hanya sebagai makhluk mitologi yang dianggap memiliki kekuatan gaib dan sebagai pelindung. Jika dilihat dari tapel atau juga kedok barongket yang ada di Bali, ada suatu perpaduan antara kebudayaan Hindu dengan kebudayaan Bali kuno, khususnya yang bercorak Buddha. Tapi semakin banyak pula terdapat di negara penganut Buddha seperti Jepang dan Cina. Diduga kesenian barongket merupakan ciri khas Hindu Bali.
Diduga kesenian barongket merupakan ciri khas Hindu Bali dan bentuk dari adanya akulturasi budaya Cina yang masuk ke Indonesia. Tari barongket yang juga biasa disebut sebagai tari Banaspati Raja atau Raja Hutan adalah kombinasi dari singa, macan atau sapi. Binatang tersebut dianggap mempunyai keangkeran atau juga kekuatan supranatural. Konsep barong di Bali sebagai raja seperti barong singa atau reog pada masyarakat Jawa. Hanya saja terdapat sedikit perbedaan. Apabila barong singa di Jawa dianggap sebagai pihak yang salah, di Bali barong dianggap sebagai lambang kebaikan.
Ladies and gentlemen, now we would like to invite our moderator for this last session, the Chief of Branch, Intergovernmental Processes, Interagency Cooperation and Partnership within United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Ms. Paola Albrito, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Excellencies, esteemed panelists, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is a real pleasure to welcome you to the closing ceremony of the 5th edition of the World Reconstruction Conference. I was already introduced, so we can go definitely directly into the substance. First of all, to give you a little taste in terms of the contribution and the attendance to the conference. We had over 3,600 people that registered for the conference and that attended in person with over 1,600 participants, and the rest of them actually joined online. This increased number of participants is a reflection on the relevance of the thematic that has been discussed in the past 2 days. These figures also talk to our passion for engaging and learning from one another in recovering from disasters, conflict, and complex crises. Despite and because of challenges and call for action that we have faced during the last 2 years, we are continuing to grow the community of actors around the world committed to building back better in recovery, turning disasters into opportunities for sustainable development with resilient and more equitable societies. Before we get started, I would like to thank our colleagues from UNDP, GFDRR, UNDRR, and the International Recovery Platform for organizing the conference and convening the global community of practice for disaster recovery for the 5th time. As a representative of UNDRR, I could not be more pleased that we are hosting this conference together again with the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. Through the last 2 days of discussions, it is very clear that the path to recovery does not just build a better version of what we lost, but advances the risk reduction, the climate risk, and sustainable development agenda. Indeed, we do not only need to build back better, but we need and we must build what we need to be sustainable and to reduce the risk of vulnerability. Through the lenses of the midterm review of the Sendai framework, the discussion heard during the conference showcased the kind of reflection, innovation, agility, and strategic thinking that are necessary if we are to chart a course forward for the latter half of the Sendai framework, the SDGs, the climate, and the overall Agenda 2030. But I'm also very excited to hear more about the reflection from the esteemed colleagues today. As a first step, I would like to kindly invite the 4 panelists to take the floor up in the podium. And before we get to our panelists, I'm delighted to call upon a few of our World Reconstruction Conference delegates to share their succinct reflection on what they've heard. With this, I would like to invite from the floor Ms. Miriam Ursua. She's the Secretary, Risk and Civil Protection from the Government City of Mexico. The floor is yours. A micro will reach you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. En primer lugar, yo quisiera agradecer la posibilidad de hacer estas reflexiones sobre el trabajo que hemos realizado durante estos 2 días. Importante destacar especialmente la activa y la amplia participación que todos los delegados de todos los países y sectores presentes han hecho durante este tiempo. Hemos compartido experiencias que beneficiarán el trabajo futuro de la gestión de riesgo y de la resiliencia y, por supuesto, que contribuirán, tal como decías tú, de manera sólida a alcanzar los objetivos del marco de Sendai. La reconstrucción de un futuro sustentable requiere que tengamos conciencia de que para construir resiliencia a través de la recuperación del COVID-19 tenemos que llevar a cabo acciones que verdaderamente impacten y transformen nuestro mundo de una manera mucho más justa, de una manera muchísimo más inclusiva, ambientalmente mucho más solidaria y comprometida. La prevención es nuestra fuerza y seguiremos trabajando en ello todos los que aquí hemos estado presentes. Finalmente, solamente decir que los trabajos que desarrollaron cada una de las regiones potenciará y fortalecerá las acciones de los países y beneficiará a las comunidades a alcanzar sociedades mucho más seguras, mucho más preparadas, más resilientes y más humanas. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. Indeed, prevention needs to be our strongest strength. And now I would like to pass the floor to Ms. Rahma Khalifa, Secretary General of the UNDRR Alliance.
Thank you very much, Ms. Paola. It's such an honor to be in this forum, the big forum of World Reconstruction Conference, the 2 days in Mangupura, Hibiscus, and Jakarta room. I learned so many things, and I really reflect because even in Indonesia, we have so many disasters, and we have so many difficult problems when facing into the reconstruction, adding the pandemic situation. I noted more than 10 points, which I couldn't convey all, but among them is when we heard about these anticipatory actions, anticipatory financing, which brings me reflecting on my Future Literacy Lab journey that I had since last year. I had a Future Literacy Lab on future of homes. We used the reframing of homeless. So what will happen if we are homeless? And then I think that it doesn't have to be 10 or 15 years, but actually we have some relatives that are homeless because of disaster. We have many displaced persons, for example, in Palu, in Semeru, in Lombok, and I believe throughout the session, I learned from many countries, from many continents, which faces the similar problem. And the last session was the pre-disaster recovery plan. It's my first time that I know there is pre-disaster recovery plan. I know there is BCP and all the friends of BCP, but PDRP is a complementary of DRR measures. And this is built through the long science, building the database, and also understanding how is the recovery process of past disasters and embedded into DRR measures. Planning is very important, but even though we have a very good plan, there is always uncertainties. COVID is one of the examples that we are really facing. And we always have unimaginable situation that always we missed in the planning. So in these things I heard in sessions to have flexible financing, flexible governments, I believe it's very important. And also to have this co-creation approach. It is mentioned through Holy Triangle. In Indonesia, we have 5 helix or pentahelix, consisting of government, academic, media, community, and private sectors. And when we talk about inclusivity, co-creation, I think it's very important when it is mentioned about co-creation in some of the session. Co-creation together with the women, we address the need of the women, addressing and discussing together with the disabled person, because we have many disabled persons attending this session, and when they are
invited participating, they can also address their need and build better, including children and youth, and also indigenous people and so on. So building them to the table and co-creating is very important. And finally, the science, technology, and innovation is embedded into the whole process, so we can learn from the past and innovate and also anticipate better the future. Thank you very much for this wonderful session. I'm very happy to attend. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rahma. Indeed, flexible finance, governance, co-creation, and innovation. These are very important actions that we need to work on. And now I would like to pass the floor to Ms. Ella Nurlela from the Association of Indonesian Women with Disability.
Terima kasih atas kesempatannya. Selamat sore, saya Ella Nurlela dari Himpunan Wanita Disabilitas Indonesia, Kabupaten Cianjur, Jawa Barat, Indonesia. Selama 2 hari di sini, saya mengucapkan terima kasih banyak atas kesempatan yang telah diberikan. Sebagai penyandang disabilitas, saya bisa mengikuti kegiatan yang luar biasa seperti ini. Adapun kaitannya kebencanaan dengan disabilitas itu sangat erat sekali. Karena setiap orang memiliki potensi untuk menjadi disabilitas. Baik itu dalam keadaan terjadi bencana maupun tidak. Dan harapan saya ke depan semoga semua yang di Sindai Framework itu mampu memberikan akses dan juga peringatan dini yang bisa diakses oleh semua orang, tidak terkecuali penyandang disabilitas dengan berbagai ragam hambatannya. Mungkin itu yang bisa saya sampaikan. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Ella, for this contribution and for really highlighting the needs of early warning system to embrace and to see the participation of all. So thank you very much for providing your perspective and key takeaway from the conference. And now it is my great pleasure to hand the floor to our esteemed panel. First, allow me to welcome Mr. Sameh Wahba to take the floor. Mr. Wahba is the Global Director for the World Bank's Urban Disaster Risk Management, Resilience and Land Global Practice. Mr. Wahba, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paola, and thanks to the 3 colleagues for their interventions, which were really appreciated. And I also wanted to thank the very rich cultural performance that evokes the cultural richness of this unique island in Indonesia. Many thanks to our partners, UNDP, UNDRR, IRP, and of course our host government, the government of Indonesia, for dedicating so much time and energy to making this 5th edition of the World Reconstruction Conference a success. And finally, a special thanks to all of you, our speakers, our participants who've joined us here in Bali and who participated, also those who participated virtually, sharing their insights and the many dimensions of this conference theme on reconstruction for a sustainable future, building resilience through recovery in a COVID-19 transformed world. Yesterday, I challenged us to think about what we need to do differently to build resilience, protect development gains, and promote sustainable development through recovery. So from what myself and my colleagues we've heard, in the WRC5 plenaries and technical sessions, I think we're beginning to have a few answers. So with regards to question 1, how have recovery opportunities and challenges changed over the last 2 to 3 years since WRC4 with the advent of COVID-19? So we know that countries around the world have mobilized unprecedented resources to respond and recover from the complex and interconnected set of threats and challenges. But the issue is to ensure that this mobilization is used as effectively as possible for recovery in a way that builds resilience for future hazards and in a sustainable and inclusive manner. In this sense, a greener, more resilient and inclusive approach to recovery will help address these interrelations and repair the structural damage that COVID-19 has brought upon us, and of course accelerate climate mitigation and adaptation while restoring momentum on poverty alleviation and shared prosperity. With regards to question number 2, what have we learned from implementing frameworks for recovery from the socioeconomic devastation of the pandemic? We know that governments have organized responses to stabilize their economies and societies and to lay the basis for a sustainable recovery. But of course, given the scale of the devastation, a multi-sectoral response is needed with the involvement of both national and international actors. With regards to question number 3 on how have existing governance models, performed in complex crises, we know that while the pandemic dominated the global stage, local disasters and conflicts have continued to happen with significant impacts on lives and livelihoods. So in some situations, disasters and conflicts occurred in the same space, which meant that the complexity of recovery was further increased. Existing governance models have not been up to the task of planning and managing recovery. This is particularly the case for the interconnected disaster conflict events. Now, key governance challenges include, the role of national disaster management agencies in a public health crisis, jurisdictional challenges in recovering from a national emergency like COVID-19 and localized disasters, capacity constraints, how to reach vulnerable populations, the ability to obtain, understand, and communicate information, and then how to build resilience to future shocks. With regards to question number 4 on what do we as international partners do differently and better, ASG Okai will enumerate the changes that we would need to consider as she shares our joint communiqué. But also in light of the deliberations, I think there are some ingredients that are starting to appear as particularly critical, such as supporting adapted and agile disaster recovery, damage and needs assessment, in collaboration, of course, with our partners in the UN and the EU, emphasizing and financing and implementing Build Back Better from disasters as a guiding principle, including resilient structural and non-structural solutions, right-sizing and right-siting the infrastructure and facilities, and greening the recovery process. Also, helping and financing countries in designing, preparing, and implementing disaster recovery projects, and converting the challenges of disaster recovery into opportunities for policies and investment for disaster risk reductions. So based on our deliberation and commitments, we look forward to achieving the promise of this conference to reconstruct for a sustainable future and build resilience through recovery in a COVID-19 transformed world. Salamat, success.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wahba, for your insights, but also the thoughts and for guiding us through the key elements that have emerged from the conference and overall in terms of building back better and recovery. And now it is my great pleasure to give the floor to my colleague, Mr. Ricardo Mena. Mr. Mena is the Director of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Mr. Mena, please go ahead.
Thank you, Paola, and it's a pleasure to be here with you at this ceremony closing the World Reconstruction Conference 5. And I have to, of course, thank also our partners, Sameh, Asako, and also the representative of the host country for having worked together over this past year and a half, I think, organizing this event. And it is, of course, an opportunity to thank you for the opportunity to address you at the conclusion of this fifth reconstruction conference. I think that this World Reconstruction Conference has come at a crucial point. We have lived through more than 2 years of a 1 in 100 year type of event, this COVID-19 pandemic. We have seen millions of lives lost, and the consequences of the pandemic impact every aspect of society. It has been what we call a textbook example of the systemic nature of risk. As with most disasters, the most vulnerable among us were hardest hit, unfortunately. And when we last met for this conference in 2019, at that time our theme was inclusion for resilient recovery, and it could not have been more timely. When the pandemic struck, not long after the World Reconstruction Conference 4, inclusion and equity quickly became critical issues for response and recovery. Hopefully, the lessons taken away from that reconstruction conference inform policies and practices when they were most needed at the onset of the pandemic. And I think that this World Reconstruction Conference, the fifth such conference, has shown us that we already know and have much of what we need to build back better after COVID-19 and actually other hazards as well. We already have adapted existing tools and knowledge to meet the emerging challenges. We learn how to assess damage and the recovery needs in the context of a pandemic, and we know how post-disaster recovery needs assessment tools can be adapted to understand the pandemic's wide-ranging and interconnected impacts. And we are aware also of what is needed to contain the pandemic and how to protect the most vulnerable. So the pandemic has shown us also that we can indeed build back better from this and future disasters through greener, more equitable, and more resilient development. Some national and local governments have grappled with response and recovery from the pandemic while simultaneously facing disasters and conflict. They know recovery strategies must address both short-term recovery needs as well as longer-term resilience and climate objectives. The challenges for recovery planners are therefore numerous, but we have seen many solutions and good practices emerge that can shape future recovery. As we bring this conference to a close, we will continue to build on what we have achieved here. Recommendations coming out of the joint communiqué will inform the seventh session of the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction that will be starting tomorrow, as you all know. And it will also inform the midterm review of the Sendai framework, which is a critical exercise that will allow us the opportunity to refocus, identify what needs to be accelerated and scaled up to make sure that we can meet the outcome, goal, and priorities for action of the Sendai framework by 2030. The outcomes of this World Reconstruction Conference 5 will also be further shared with the international community through the International Recovery Platform and contribute to our shared endeavors to build a more resilient, equitable, and sustainable world. So, congratulations and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mena, for your reflection, your way forward in highlighting what are going to be the next steps in practical terms concerning the outcome of the conference, but also for your call in order to see these recommendations turning into action on the ground. Thank you very much, Ricardo. And now it is my great pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Asako Okai, Assistant Secretary General and Director for the Crisis Bureau at UNDP. She will give some reflections and she will share some elements of the World Reconstruction Conference 5 joint communique. Asako, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paolo. It is my distinct pleasure to be able to report to you on what we collectively concluded in the World Reconstruction Conference number 5. Since the framing has been ably given by my colleagues Sameh of World Bank and then Ricardo of the UNDRR, I will straight go into the joint communique. The 5th edition of the World Reconstruction Conference gathered people representing 160 countries with 1,600 in-person and online participants from national and local government, civil society, the private sector, academia, and international organizations from around the world. It shared experiences on resilience and sustainability dimensions of recovery with a view to advance the implementation of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030. The conference noted that with the advent of the COVID-19, the world has been transformed with the severe socio-economic consequences that are likely to outlast the pandemic, particularly for the most vulnerable. Therefore, I will go into the deliberation on the issues of the recovery for the sustainable future that we collectively resolved to take action. First, use recovery from the pandemic, disasters, conflict, and other threats as an opportunity to reset the development pathway toward a greener and more resilient future. Secondly, to address the social and economic effect and impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on hard-won development gains. Noting that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected the most vulnerable population, there is a need to have organized responses to stabilize economies and societies, seeking to forestall further damage and lay the basis for a sustainable recovery and work toward long-term outcomes of human well-being. Thirdly, rethink our recovery governance models in order to better plan and manage recovery from complex and interconnected disaster conflict events in the post-COVID-19 world. Addressing the challenges of the recovery in urban environment demands approaches that consider the interconnectedness of urban systems, the complexity of vulnerabilities, and the need of the urban poor and leveraging local knowledge and diverse financing. Innovative solutions for urban recovery include ex-ante planning, investments, and programs aligned with development plans and strategies that maximizes co-benefit of the sustainable development, climate change, local resilience. Fourthly, change our behavior and actions to build resilience through recovery and then reconstruct for sustainable futures. We have decided to take 6 actions. First action number 1. We call for and commit to a resilient recovery process that will build back better, put agency in the hand of affected people, implement predictable and pre-arranged financial, institutional, and technical at all levels, embrace and explore new technologies and mechanisms such as anticipatory action, and prioritize medium to long-term outcomes, recognizing that recovery takes a long time. Action number 2, We call on all policymakers to put health system recovery that incorporates sustainable risk management measures, resilient health infrastructure, universal health coverage at the center. Action number 3, we emphasize the need for a shock-responsive universal social protection for all vulnerable groups to ensure secure income and consumption to sustain communities during a crisis. Action number 4, we recognize that the critical infrastructure recovery requires strong collaboration with the civil society and communities, utilization of local knowledge, and coherence with SDG 9. Action number 5, we seek the cooperation of all governments, partners, and agencies to closely monitor recovery programs to ensure that it's green, sustainable, and directing recovery funds into domains such as renewable energy, waste management, green jobs, and nature-based solutions to contribute toward disasters and climate resilience and sustainable development. Lastly, action number 6, we seek to develop and adopt gender-responsive recovery governance strategies and processes to address the gender dimension of disasters, conflict, and fragility, and other threats such as COVID-19. So all of us together, the World Reconstruction Conference number 5 concluded that resilient and sustainable recovery is not a luxury. It is an imperative for a better future. I think we have all agreed in the great foundation that would inform, as Ricardo said, for the global platform for disaster risk reduction, which will open tomorrow, and then also the midterm review of the Sendai framework. I think we have done a great job. Congratulations to all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Okai, for sharing the key element of the communique and the 6 actions that are highlighted, that hopefully all of us are going to be implementing as per now. And now it is my great pleasure to pass the floor to Mr. Lilik Kurniawan, Primary Secretary of the National Disaster Management Agency for the Government of Indonesia, to give his remark. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paola. Om Swastiastu, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat sore dan salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Sebelum saya memulai, izinkan saya memberikan penghormatan pada rekan kami yang ada di sini, Mr. Sameh Wahba dari Bank Dunia, Mr. Ricardo Mena dari UNDRR, Ms. Asako Okai dari UNDP, dan seluruh partisipan yang telah hadir baik secara langsung maupun secara daring yang mengikuti penutupan acara World Reconstruction Conference yang kelima di Bali, Indonesia. Bapak Ibu sekalian, pertama-tama saya mewakili pemerintah Indonesia mengucapkan terima kasih atas kepercayaan menyelenggarakan konferensi yang sangat penting mengenai pemulihan World Reconstruction Conference yang kelima di Indonesia. Tentu ini adalah suatu kebanggaan kami didatangi oleh para pelaku penanggulangan bencana seluruh dunia untuk berbicara, membuat satu narasi, satu kesimpulan, satu pemikiran mengenai pemulihan yang lebih baik lagi di masa yang akan datang. Selamat telah berhasil menjalankan berbagai diskusi, membahas mengenai pemulihan dan rekonstruksi mengenai pasca bencana. Konferensi tahun ini adalah konferensi yang kelima, yang pertama kali diadakan di Jenewa tahun 2011, yang menetapkan fondasi yang kuat untuk kerangka kerja internasional untuk pemulihan dan rekonstruksi pasca bencana. Setelah itu, konferensi ini telah berkomitmen kuat untuk memastikan prinsip inklusivitas terlaksana dalam membangun ketangguhan yang merupakan kunci menuju a sustainable future. Dari pelaksanaan konferensi ini, tentu banyak hal yang telah didiskusikan dan disepakati bersama terkait dengan berbagai topik yang telah didiskusikan demi terbangunnya a sustainable future sesuai dengan tema tahun ini. Kami dari Indonesia mengapresiasi dukungan dan rekognisi dari lembaga-lembaga pembangunan internasional dan negara-negara sahabat dalam sesi opening ceremony terkait capaian Indonesia dalam penanganan bencana di Indonesia. Indonesia Post Disaster Need Assessment atau kami sebut sebagai G2 PASNA dan Disaster Recovery Index merupakan bukti nyata hasil dari kepedulian dan pemikiran kita bersama dan tidak akan terwujud tanpa kerjasama yang baik di antara para pihak yang terkait. Di antaranya adalah praktisi, akademia, mitra, NDMI, negara sahabat, lembaga pembangunan internasional, rekan-rekan NGO, CSO, dan pihak-pihak swasta pemerhati kebencanaan. Pertama kali, kita semua mengalami krisis pandemi COVID-19. Kita berefleksi dan belajar bersama dari situasi krisis ini. Kita belajar mulai dari merubah dari uncertainty menjadi suatu yang pasti atau certainty. Bagaimana kemudian untuk membangun resilient dan sustainable future, terutama dari kondisi pasca krisis. Paradigma dalam penanganan pemulihan pasca krisis mengalami transisi yang signifikan. Perencanaan infrastruktur, green to green, bukan hanya dari aspek teknikal, tetapi secara komprehensif dalam aspek regulasi, hubungan pemangku kepentingan, dan tata laksananya. Pada acara pembukaan disebutkan bahwa kita perlu melangkah lebih jauh, tidak hanya sebatas pemulihan, tetapi pemulihan yang terfokus pada livelihood dan kemiskinan untuk tujuan yang lebih besar, yaitu membangun ketangguhan, baik ketangguhan masyarakat, ketangguhan sistem, ketangguhan kelembagaan, dan lain sebagainya. Kita juga merefleksikan satu hal yang penting, leave no one behind. Penting bagi kita untuk mempertahankan life dan livelihood. Penting untuk memperhatikan pemulihan infrastruktur skala kecil, menengah, dan penting untuk mengutamakan kelompok yang rentan dalam upaya membangun resilient communities. Beberapa pelajaran juga kita dapat dalam situasi double burden yang dialami selama masa pandemi terkait dengan perlindungan sosial terhadap pandemik. Sebagai contoh, selama masa bencana sebelum pandemi, kita telah mengidentifikasi kelompok-kelompok paling rentan. Tetapi bencana yang terjadi di masa pandemi telah memunculkan kelompok rentan baru yang sebelumnya belum teridentifikasi. Oleh karena itu, to transfer risk to resilient, we need responsibility from multi-stakeholder. Baik yang hadir di sini, maupun yang mengikuti konferensi ini secara daring, untuk dapat bersama-sama melaksanakan apa yang direkomendasikan sesuai dengan kapasitas dan tanggung jawab masing-masing, serta bersama memonitor pelaksanaannya. Akhir kata, terima kasih kepada seluruh pihak yang telah berkontribusi dalam World Reconstruction Conference kelima ini dapat terlaksana dengan baik dan lancar. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kurniawan, for your remarks, and also thank you to the government of Indonesia for hosting this important conference. Now, before closing the conference, I would like to invite you to view a very short video, 2 or 3 minutes, in order to get an insight on what has happened during the conference. Along with our host, the government of Indonesia, it is now my privilege to welcome you all to the 7th session of the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, which will be held under the theme of From Risk to Resilience towards Sustainable Development for All in a COVID-19 transformed world. With that, I'm pleased that to formally brings this 5th edition of the World Reconstruction Conference to a close. On behalf of the co-organizer of the World Reconstruction Conference 5, I wish to thank you for your generosity in sharing your comments, your insight. Thank our generous host, our distinguished speakers and participants. We look forward to continuing our discussion with you over the next 3 days.